consortium in the open entrance project. You see here, in addition, let's say, to me and my affiliation at Vienna University of Technology in Vienna, Austria, also a few remaining partners and their affiliations, but in addition, the consortium is even much bigger. So I will show that then in my final slide in the acknowledgement. So it's a pleasure to me to give some kind of, let's say, similarities to the talk of Professor Penson, focusing on California. And I will focus here on Europe. So how it could work out in the next 20, 30 years to completely decarbonize our energy and transport system. So this work was motivated mainly or manifold. So first, a couple of years ago, we only had some kind of, let's say, gradual increase of renewable shares in our systems in mind, in our policies. And the focus was more or less the year 2030. But this increasingly has been overlapping with the carbon neutrality, climate neutrality discussion. And now, also due to COVID, and now the actions, the policy actions we are taking in Europe, so with the new Green Deal, focusing on 2030, and the Green Recovery Plan, so it's supposed to be some kind of infrastructure plan and also accelerating, let's say, the fuel switches. So this was one kind of motivation, not only to focus on 2030 isolated, but already having in mind, let's say, 2040 and 2050 in these kind of rather short-term implementations. Then the second aspect was to better combine energy system models and climate models. So to better align, let's say, these kind of analysis of these, let's say, previously two separated communities. And finally, it was the open source approach that we want to deliver some products, an open platform here, a scenario explorer where third parties around the globe can, on the one hand, improve and extend the functionalities of the energy system models and any kind of models and the data sets we have there, and can conduct their own analysis. So how to understand our kind of scenarios I will present now in the next 30 minutes. So they are based or they build upon 4 different storylines. So these are narratives how the European energy and transport system could finally be or could develop, but these are of course no predictions. So these are stories and narratives, and details about that can be found on the website openentrance.eu. So I will present the quantitative scenarios, of course, based on these kind of storylines. Our studies, they comply with the European fraction of the 1.5 and 2, one scenario of the 2-degree global warming target. So this is very important. So this was one of the motivations to better link energy system and climate modeling, and we used the integrated assessment model message IX Globium to fix, let's say, the quantitative numbers in the different scenarios in terms of, for instance, remaining CO2 budget, finally to achieve this 1.5 or 2 degrees. And of course, the main determining factors in our models then. So there is one main energy system model. It's called the Genesis mod. It's a dispatch and a capacity investment model available already, fully open access and open source on the platform. And this model, of course, finally shows the fuel switches depending on the different scenario settings for achieving, let's say, the different ambitions of climate neutrality, even either already in 2040 or 2050. And these scenario results, they not only show the necessities of the optimization model to find feasible solutions. So for us in academia and in the research community, this is supposed to be clear. If we have some kind of optimization models, then we have some kind of constraints, and then our results, for instance, the dual variable, they show the more or less, or the shadow price of the optimization result, and this is, for instance, if the constraint is the CO2 budget, the remaining one, this is simply then the CO2 price. So this is to some extent a little bit surprising, maybe for policymakers, also for the industry, because our kind of results, they rather show, of course, significantly increasing CO2 prices in the years to come in the future. But these results, they also show what is really needed in terms of fuel switches if we seriously intend to mitigate global warming. And therefore, let's say our experience in the past, what's supposed to be feasible or even financeable, might not be sufficient anymore. And therefore, we also intentionally have not used some kind of business as usual terminology anymore. We'll see then in the next slide in the storyline definition that we used some, or we already take into account some kind of disruptions in the energy and transport system. And as I said, the open source, open data, open access approach shall accelerate the knowledge transfer on several levels, not only academia and the research community, but also in the industry and so on. So our storyline approach is based on more or less 3 dimensions describing 3 uncertain developments in the next decades. On the one hand, in terms of technologies, technology breakthrough. So will, for instance, CCS or any other kind of carbon removal technologies be, let's say, implemented? Will they come, and can they be implemented commercially? So we have heard a lot of interesting aspects already today in the conference. So this is one dimension, the technology. Then society and the attitude, the public attitude. Is society really proactive and interested to follow and to proactively shape this energy transition or not? Or is it a rather reluctant transfer? And finally, of course, the policy ambitions. So these are the 3 dimensions, and our storylines, they always describe the combination of 2 out of these 3 dimensions. For instance, here in yellow, we see techno-friendly. This describes where rather the market delivers, let's say, the new technologies. We have significant technology breakthrough, and let's say policy steering is not needed as much compared to the remaining storylines. So for instance, the directed transition, the green storyline, rather describes a reluctant society, but on the other hand, there's a strong policy support that the technologies, the novel technologies, they are implemented very fast. And societal commitment, on the other hand, is rather the combination of society and policy, where we have rather to stick to the existing technologies. So we won't have, let's say, this significant breakthrough of novel technologies, CCS, carbon removal technologies, floating offshore wind turbines, and so on. And what's important in our analysis is when conducting the input scaling of our models, that these scalings, they comply to the 1.5 degree global warming targets. So this is these are the 3, let's say, ambitious stories, and let's say a rather conservative compromise of several of them is the gradual development in the origin of these coordinates. And this story complies to the 2 degree scenarios. But what's very important, so we show quantitative results for, let's say, for these 4 storylines, but the open source approach and the overall idea is of this scenario explorer we developed here that, of course, everybody can conduct her or his own studies within, let's say, this three-dimensional cube, putting, let's say, the different weights then, of course, in the empirical settings of the energy system model. So here, I won't go into the details, the flow chart of the modeling approach. So what I present here is, let's say, the green part. And it's very important in our kind of analysis. On the one hand, we had an initial version of this energy system model, genesis model, of this dispatch and capacity investment model. It builds upon the osmosis model having been developed more than 10 years ago. It is a significant further development and tailor-made according to our needs, not only in terms of functionalities, but also granularity and so on. But it's also very important that with our input data settings, we are consistent and coherent with other modeling activities in Europe. So on the one hand, with the PRIMES model, having conducted a lot of studies for the European Commission, or in terms also of the renewable potentials we have, the cost resource curves with the Green X model and so on. And in addition, it also was important to conduct, of course, a validation of our model and of our scenario results with the most alike existing pathways, also from the message IX Globium model, to be sure to deliver a robust result. So I will present today the aggregated European results. We already have the country-specific results, draft results available, but we'll further, let's say, work on the robustness of these kind of results. So the Genesis model, let's say, is initially it was a simple dispatch and capacity investment model. On the left-hand side, we see the granularity at the starting point. On the right-hand side, we see the granularity right now. We have it on country level, except the Western Balkan region. And in terms of functionalities, here you only see a short, let's say, list of improvements we have been implemented. There have been done a lot further of the improvements. So from originally 17 regions to 30 plus, and also in terms of temporal modeling. So from the initial time slices, they have been replaced by a reduced hourly resolution and a time clustering algorithm. So this is very important to deliver much more robust results within, let's say, feasible, let's say, simulation time period. So 24 or 36 hours or so. And of course, in terms of empirical data in the different sectors and end uses, granularity has been significantly improved. And what's also important, so initially there only was the CO2 budget constraint functionality available, but also a carbon price and exogenous carbon price mechanism was implemented. And we used both of these functionalities depending on the storyline. So for instance, the directed transition storyline, which describes, let's say, a strong political or policy, let's say, support and in steering of the energy transition process, relies on a CO2 budget, on a remaining CO2 budget, and then simply the model, the dual variable of the optimization model, shows us what's supposed to be the needed CO2 price to, let's say, to achieve the technology exchange rates and the corresponding fuel switches to comply finally to the CO2 budget constraints and ultimately, of course, to comply to carbon neutrality in 2040 and 2050. And in the remaining storylines, we have used rather the CO2 price mechanism, Also somehow, so for instance, for the societal commitment, somehow to show that we need, on the one hand, for the industry and for the utility industry and bigger industries, you can use trading cap and trading systems, but on the other hand, for the mass market, for the residential and small commercial consumers, you need some kind of CO2 taxes, because in practice it's virtually impossible to cover them based on cap and trade systems. So I will show a few selected results. So what's let's say common more or less for several of the storylines and the quantitative results. So we have to decrease final energy demand and therefore also primary energy demand ultimately to 50% or below 50% compared to right now. So the significant reduction in demand is supposed to be a precondition somehow to be able to manage this energy transition. Here in societal commitment, for instance, on the left-hand side, we see primary energy, and this is the only scenario. So it's an extreme scenario where we also anticipated completely phase out, for instance, of nuclear in electricity generation. So in real life, of course, this is hardly, or you can hardly achieve this, but for us it just was of interest if it theoretically could work. So, but this is the only scenario, of course, where we more or less put the constraint in our optimization model to have, let's say, a complete decommissioning of nuclear. On the other hand, for the other scenarios, for the techno-friendly or for the directed transition, so we implemented also not only lifetime extensions for existing nuclear power plants, notably for those countries relying heavily on nuclear like France and also others, or also a few countries like Poland, they consider rather to phase into nuclear power because they have 80–90% coal-fired power plants at present. So this is very important, let's say, to get an idea. So what are the cornerstones within our three-dimensional cube? And as I already said, so the advantage of these, let's say, products we deliver is that somebody can conduct their own studies with their own settings within and choosing the weights within this three-dimensional cube. And in societal commitment, we also anticipate that we do not have any kind of CO2 removal technologies available. So therefore, we more or less must be able to fully decarbonize our system within the next 20 years. So on the other hand, we see it then later in the techno-friendly scenario, we assume CCS and other CO2 removal technologies. Therefore, of course, you can produce also or emit CO2 also in 45 and 50. So here in the societal commitment on the left-hand side, you see like electricity generation. We also have seen it this morning in California that the energy system in general will be significantly much more electrified compared to the status quo. Also, we also see here that the electricity generation doubles in Europe compared to 2020 up to 2050. And here in yellow, we see the significant photovoltaic penetration. So this includes both utility scale PV, but also the rooftop PV based on local market clearings, microgrids, energy communities, and so on. And we also used in one of the case studies the URBS model from Munich. Also Professor Penson has been talking about. So we rather use it for sector coupling analysis in urban areas and local market clearings, and then upscaling on country level, and then finally of course, determining the effect on European level. So here you see for the societal commitment in the residential sector. So in orange we have gas, so we still rely on gas until 45, and then we phase out and we have a strong switch towards heat pumps, air sourced and ground sourced. On the right hand side, in the industry, we also rely on the one hand on gas until 2040, 45, and in yellow you also see the strong electrification of the industry sector. And the transport sector on the left hand side, the passenger transport, it's straightforward that here we rather rely on petrol electric vehicles, and on the right hand side in the freight transport, as we also heard for California, and the heavy duty transport, it's supposed to be hydrogen based transport fuel cells, and of course also others. So here the techno-friendly, as I said, here for instance, so we have nuclear still in 2050, it rather decreases. So on the one hand, due to lifetime extensions, it is still part of the solution space, and in some cases also new capacities are built in our cost minimization approach, but in general, rather nuclear cannot compete in the cost minimization approach. This rather is based on the national policies we have, and we in Europe intend to also stick to these or to them in the next 10, 15 years or so. So here on the techno-friendly, you see less PV and more wind. So the gray blue and the dark blue area. So this is onshore and offshore wind. And for instance, here it's more or less 50-50% onshore and offshore wind. And offshore wind is here in 2050, 1,700 terawatt hours. So this is more than double of the offshore wind, let's say, scenario of the IEA study in Europe until 2040. So it's more or less aligned until 2040 with the IEA study, but it's in 2050 significantly, let's say, more like in a recent study of the IEA. And as I said, so here we have the breakthrough of technologies like CCS and carbon removal technologies, and therefore on the left-hand side you see the fraction of CO2 emissions we can have, and on the right-hand side you see again the industry sector, and in gray you see still the CO2 we can emit because we are able to handle this in our technology portfolio. And here on the directed transition you see, so in again the primary energy also decreases, but the technology portfolio and the fuel mix is let's say much more diverse compared to the remaining two scenarios, and also here the nuclear, the wine red fraction is rather high, and this also represents let's say the phase in or the extension of the capacities in a few European countries based on policy decisions. So not necessarily based on the cost minimization trade-off result of our optimization model, but we put these policies as a constraint into our analysis. And finally, the gradual development is, let's say, a little bit of each of the remaining three scenarios, but more, let's say, more conservative and less ambitious. And we also see that we need to produce more electricity because electricity demand reduction is not that much compared to the remaining three. So two slides comparing a few KPIs of our analysis. So here on the left-hand side, you see the installed electricity generation capacities on the one hand, and the storage capacities we need finally to manage this energy transition. So in terms of electricity generation capacities, we see on the one hand in yellow the techno-friendly scenario. So this is the scenario where we have technologies with high annual utilization hours, less, let's say, decentralized local PV installations and so on. And therefore, of course, we need significantly less installed capacities compared, for instance, to the blue one, to the societal commitment, mainly due to photovoltaic installations on building integrated level, or also a small decentralized ground-mounted utility scale capacities. Or also in red, the gradual development, because this is the most conservative scenario with the least ambitious demand reduction. So here we also need significant capacities. On the right-hand side, so you see the hydrogen usage per scenario. And there are, let's say, a few interesting aspects. So the takeoff will take place in 2030, more or less. And then in 35, it significantly will be, let's say, different in different scenarios. So the directed transition, we'll see it then in the next slide, comes up with the highest CO2 price already in the next 10 to 15 years. And therefore in 2035, hydrogen becomes already earlier competitive in this scenario in the directed transition compared to the remaining ones. And for instance, in yellow, in the techno-friendly, because here we also have CO2 removal technologies, there is not that need, let's say, to build these amounts of hydrogen. But then in 2040 and beyond, so we have a significant penetration of hydrogen, because this is more or less the only option the optimization model has finally to, let's say, to kick out the remaining technologies emitting CO2, because the model has to stick to the budget constraint. And then depending, of course, on different CO2 price level, hydrogen simply becomes competitive. And in 45 and 50, for instance, also for the rather least or for the rather conservative scenarios. So the gradual development, so in red here we see the highest hydrogen production in 45 and 50. So this means because we have been lazy until 2040, so finally in 45 and 50 at very high CO2 prices, let's say the model decides finally to produce hydrogen to somehow stick, let's say, to the settings in the model. And this here we see the development of the CO2 prices until 2050, so starting from right now, 2020, 21. And as I already said, green, the directed transition. So this represents the shadow price of the CO2 budget constraint of the optimization model. And here we already start in the next 5 to 10 years with a rather significant and high CO2 price, finally to be able to manage these transition. And in the other scenarios, we are, let's say, a little bit more lazy until 2030, but then the remaining CO2 budget finally needs to be, let's say, mitigated at rather high CO2 price levels also then towards the end. So for us in academia or in research, we might not be scared, let's say, about the CO2 prices of 200, 300, 400 euros per ton in the next, let's say, 10 to 15 years, or even then beyond 500, 600 euros per ton in the longer term. But this is, let's say, more or less the necessity, simply that the optimization model not only finds feasible solutions, but this is, let's say, the price signal. Finally, we need to, let's say, deliver to the energy and transport system, finally to to implement the fuel switches until 2050. So my last slide. So I don't want to go into details anymore and repeat, let's say, the kind of results. It's very important that we start right now with the implementation of our, let's say, policies and the fuel switches. Depending, of course, on the different scenarios, we see different weights on technologies and technology exchange rates. The directed transition, let's say, the strong policy steering, of course, is the most or the least risky approach, because the others, the other stories and scenarios I have shown. So here we are rather still lazy in the next 5 to 10 years. And then have to catch up beyond 2030, but then we also rely that we can deliver the corresponding novel technologies and so on, and this is supposed to be much more risky than, let's say, starting right now with already strong policy support and strong policy steering. And what we also have seen that the remaining 1/3 of the emissions, to remove them, that this takes place then in the longer term at very high CO2 prices. So here we're talking about 500, 600, 700 euros per ton, or even above them. So finally, I'd like to invite you to have a look at the Open Entrance Scenario Explorer. Here you see the link. As I said, it's still work under progress, but we delivered already these kind of results, and also the Genesis mode model. It's already available, fully open source. Of course, we further improve it, and we'll deliver then in the next couple of months also the robust country-specific results. But as I said, so this kind of analysis is completely free for third parties, and hopefully it is widely used and further developed in the future to accelerate, let's say, the diffusion of understanding, let's say, in the communities about these energy transition challenges. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge, let's say, the work and acknowledge the support of several of the partners in the Open Entrance project. So here you can see the link again. So it's really exciting to work together in this team, and hopefully we are also successful to get some kind of follow-up grant to prolong this cooperation. So thank you very much, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Hans. Yeah, we actually have 1 or 2 questions for you. So the first one, I think, has to do with the kind of the assumptions underlying some of the results you presented in terms of like the choice and the cost assumptions behind the technologies. So the question is about what assumptions do you make about like the extended life of nuclear power, and what's the cost assumption for offshore wind, and the assumption for the extended life for the nuclear power. And the reason is that you see the share of offshore wind being very large in 2050. So I want to understand how that came about.
Yeah. I will answer your question very soon. So on the open platform, you already can see, let's say, the data sets and the assumptions and the CAPEX and OPEX of several kind of technologies. So this already is completely open for everybody to have a look to have a look on it. Yeah. So the issue. So we more or less used, let's say, the empirical settings or the input settings also from other European models having been extensively used in the past and are still being used. So it's mainly from the Green X model, which delivers, let's say, that the cost resource curves for several, let's say, technologies, and also the corresponding assumptions of the learning rates in terms of let's say, capex developments. And finally, offshore winds. So this also includes for the techno-friendly, or if we have these high fractions, this includes also floating offshore wind turbines already, where we assume, of course, already 5,000 full load hours per year. And then, of course, the LCOE, they, let's say, they can compete more or less with any kind of fossil fuels, or even with nuclear power. Of course, offshore wind cannot compete with onshore wind or with photovoltaics and so on. But finally, of course, it can compete with the remaining ones. So I do not exactly, let's say, now know certain capex numbers at a certain, let's say, point in time, 2030 or 2040 or so, because it's also anticipated that the capex, they follow some kind of learning rates. But you can find the input data settings and the assumptions of several of the scenarios, and the different scenarios there are different, let's say, assumptions depending on the deployment, of course, more ambitious or less ambitious learning rate of the capex per technology.
That's good. Thank you very much. And just another question I have for you is, so for this model, do you capture kind of temporal evolution of technology? So technologies improve in efficiency over time, or does the cost drop over time?
Do you mean that also the so per technology, that also the conversion efficiency will be improved? So for each technology.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. So for several of the technologies, so let's say the conversion efficiency is not a static parameter. So it's we model in 5-year steps, and every 5 years, several of the parameters, they are reconsidered, and of course, normally the efficiencies they are improved, that the conversion efficiencies that they are improved. So per technology, yeah.
Okay, so I know we are quite over time, but if I may just end with one last question before we close this session. So for the industrial sector, I imagine it's a very, very difficult sector to model. Do you simply assume electrification, or do you think about possible different pathways for decarbonizing each sector?
Yes, so this also, again, depending on the narrative, on the storyline description, and then of course on the assumption whether or not so for instance we have CCS or any kind of carbon removal technologies. So the quantitative results, they are quite let's say different. As I have shown in the societal commitment, it's rather, let's say, we need to rely on strong electrification if we cannot, let's say, enable negative, or if we can't produce emissions because we have, let's say, we can't allow negative emissions. On the other hand, in the technology-friendly scenario where we have different CO2 removal technologies, it's still, let's say, significant amounts of fossil, let's say, fueling in the industry sectors, still in 2050. So this is what we, let's say, wanted to show with this techno-friendly scenario, so that there is no need, let's say, to fully decarbonize, let's say, the industry sector in that respect.
Okay, so thank you very much again for this great presentation. I have to say that I actually like this, a very different perspective. And I liked when you started by saying that you've abolished the business as usual scenario. basically turn this analysis on its head. So thank you very much for that presentation. I will surely check out the platform, and also encourage everybody here to check it out. So with that, I'll be bringing this session to a close. I want to thank everybody here for attending. I want to thank everybody that also asked questions for helping make this a very, very interactive session. And I think at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Julie for to tell us the next activity.
Yeah, so we have a 15-minute break. I think it's a free-for-all. So really, thank you for the 3 excellent talks. Thanks, Professor Auer. This open source platforms looks extremely good for the community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I wonder if Curtis is still around. I see him, but that's a very inspirational talk by Curtis as well. Actually, I have a question. See, Curtis, are you still around?
I am still here, yes.
Super. Yeah, so I understand that the reason for using bicarbonate is because of higher solubility in liquid than just pure carbonate. Is that correct? Like, I'm thinking, why not directly reduce the carbonate anion directly in liquid? Is that because you cannot just solubilize CO3 2- a lot?
So carbonate itself is not reactive. So you need to protonate it and then convert it into CO2. So CO2 can be electrochemically reduced, right? So you can take CO2 plus electrons to form CO plus hydroxide.
Yeah, I understand. So are you saying that I cannot find the voltage and the catalyst to reduce carbonate ion directly? Because I mean, I'm thinking.
So there, it's funny. So you're bringing up actually a debate that's in the literature, because some people have claimed that you can directly reduce carbonate or bicarbonate, but those are negatively charged species, and you have this, you have an sp2 hybridized carbon center. It's not obvious to me how you actually, like, I don't think there's a clear, it's hard to go through an arrow pushing exercise to justify carbonate being reduced directly.
Okay. So you're saying
so when you look at the studies, what happens is that there's usually some proton source that has ended up actually converting that carbonate into CO2, and that's what's got reduced. And so you've got to do a really careful set of control experiments before you can make that claim. Gotcha. So I don't want to say it's outright impossible, but if it is happening, even if it can happen, it's not happening at rates that are fast enough to be meaningful for a commercial electrolyte. So
you're basically saying the reactivity for reduction is low and unclear. But how about you also show this very nice 3m of potassium bicarbonate, which I think is very high solubility. So in terms of the liquid carrying storage ability, it's also low compared to bicarbonate. Can I say that? Because I don't know that you can, of course, form solid, carbonate precipitates. But if you're thinking of just pure, carrying by liquid water phase, it sounds like the bicarbonate have high concentration, have high solubility.
That's right. That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, so that does make it very, I think, very, very inspirational, very, 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 very interesting platform. And then for the OER catalyst, you are saying the nickel foam with a 0.4 volt overpotential is lossy. But I guess, but sort of on the techno-economic side, I mean, if you don't need a hydrogen gas feed, that still sounds like a reasonable trade-off.
For the OER reaction?
Yeah, for the counter electrode, just to balance.
So that's the thermodynamic limit, but then you also have another few hundred millivolts that you need to pay the price for just because of the overpotential.
Mm-hmm.
So oxidizing water at the anode is a nice clean reaction because your byproduct is oxygen gas. So that's easy to manage. You can just flare it to the environment. But the challenge is for us is that, you know, is there a way to have that electrolyzer operate at a lower voltage? And so that's, you know, so one way to do this is to valorize like glycerol. So there are people that are looking at those types of reactions. But the people that I talk to in industry say that it's really challenging because those feedstocks are really dirty and they'll just gum up your electrolyzer, and they're tough to purify. So it's not clear to me that that is the right approach either yet, but I say that without thinking deeply enough about it before I can, you know, outrightly